Hi, everyone. Just wanted to talk with you a little bit about some of the topics of social psychology and how those fit into some of the other things that you've been learning. So, if I were to ask you, what is the one thing that you would want to do if you knew for sure that no one else would know about it? That's the whole idea behind social psychology. Like, we are impacted by what other people think about us and how other people view us, even when there's nobody there to see us. So you don't have to tell me, but what would you write on the card? Most people, when they do studies on this, write down that they would rob a bank if they knew they could get it, which is always an interesting thing to say. So, social psychology then is the study about the real or imagined presence of other people and how that affects us. And if you think about it, the first thing you do when you slip and you fall on the ice is you jump up to see if somebody else saw you, and that's the whole premise behind it. So this idea of attributions is where a lot of things come from. So what did you attribute that behavior to? It might be a disposition, that person's trait or their personality, or that's how they are. Or is it because of the situation that the person was in, they acted that way? We use these things when we're judging other people, but also we use dispositions and situational attributions when we're talking about ourselves. And so let's say you notice somebody tripping over a rug, and somebody says, "Oh, how clumsy can they be? Does he never watch where he's going?" Right? Because we don't necessarily realize that they could have tripped over something. The first intention is to always say that someone else is just clumsy, or someone else is lazy, or someone else, and that's the fundamental attribution error. So when we go too far and assuming that a person's behavior is caused by their personality, and then when you demonstrate that, right, by falling or whatever, we overestimate the dispositional attribution and we underestimate the power of the situation. So that's a big topic in social psychology. What's more powerful, the person or the situation, in determining actions? And we generally tend to minimize the situation when we're talking about other people. But when we're talking about ourselves, we often give ourselves a situational excuse, if you will. So it's called a self-serving bias. We tend to attribute our success to our dispositions, and then we're just so wonderful. And then other people, we attribute their mistakes or their success to things like, blog, or they were just didn't study, that kind of thing. So we're always in this sense of chaos, sort of, on how we are biased against other people. So one of the big issues is culture. So in the United States, we have an individualistic culture, which means that we tend to think that every single person has their own goals and they have the ability to succeed and everything is up to them. Other cultures have more of a collectivist idea, and that you put the goals of the group ahead of your own goals. And we see sub-pockets and other groups inside of the United States that are more collectivist in nature. Families who come from impoverished backgrounds tend to have a more collectivist way of viewing things, and that's why a lot of times you'll see a family using their money to pay for something that a family member needs, because it's always more of it's us together as a family versus everybody else. That's the idea of collectivism. When you look at individualism, you're looking at each person has the power to make themselves into what they want themselves to be. So your assignment for this week is to watch the Zimbardo study. And in Zimbardo, he randomly selected people to either be prisoners or guards. But what the purpose of the study was to look at what are the roles, the behaviors, and the attitudes that you expect someone in a particular group to have, and whether or not those roles would be played out. So as you watch the video, you notice that one of the guards thought he was supposed to be acting in a particular way. And so he took on a role of a really, really mean guard. And so when you watch it, you'll see this. So 1971 is Stanford, which is a prestigious university, took college-age students and randomly selected them with a flip of a coin to either be a prisoner or a prison guard. This study was supposed to last a lot longer than it did. It ended at 6 days. If you watch the Netflix version, in the movie, they had someone die. In the original Stanford study, no one died, but a lot of really negative things happened. They were strip searched, they were force fed, they had clean toilets with their toothbrush. So you just have to watch it, and yeah, the link is on the page just below this PowerPoint, so you should be able to watch it very easily. So when we have psychological discomfort, we have two different ideas. So this follows with the guard that he thought that they were being mean to the prisoners, but instead of doing anything, he just avoided the situation. And that's cognitive dissonance, when you think one thing, but you act in a different way. And we have that a lot. Some examples are like texting and driving. Most of us will agree that texting and driving is not a good idea, but we still often do it. So cognitive dissonance, it is the one thing that gets us to change, right? To change our beliefs. So how do we handle it, right? You can change your beliefs, or you can change the belief of the situation. And so most of the time, we tend to make excuses for ourselves, and we downplay our actions. We say things like, well, yeah, but I only text at the stoplights, or I only text once I'm in my neighborhood. But in reality, it's just a way to make ourselves feel a little less of that cognitive dissonance. So the word conformity, right? It has a negative idea, but not all conformity is bad. So conformity is when we adjust our behavior to fit in with the group standard. So, thankfully, most people conform to wearing clothes to classes. And so it's not all bad to conform. And there's a line that we have to figure, where do you draw the line, right? So the Solomon Asch study, there is a link right there. As you see, you could click on it, or it's also on the page. But what they did is they had, it is a conformity, and they asked which of these lines matches the standard line. It's a very easy task, and most people clearly can see what it is. And if you were faced with saying which one it was, probably would have no trouble with it. But what about if everybody else was saying the wrong answer? Would you go along? Well, in the Solomon-Asch study, 1/3 of them gave the wrong answer just because everybody else was saying. It's hard to know what we would do if we were in the study. Would you think that maybe you just weren't seeing it right? Would you be okay with being the only one to stand out? The only one who didn't say? Not sure, right? Most people conform. So it's known as the chameleon effect. We tend to mimic other people, and it's not always a bad thing. When you go into a new social situation and you don't know what to do, it's pretty nice to look around and see what other people are doing. Are they standing up? Are they sitting down? Clapping your hands? And that's how we learn. We learn from other people. And so we often will copy their things. And in social facilitation, for all of you who are sports enthusiasts, it's the reason that we have a home court advantage. Because when you're doing something that you're really good at, like a team sport, and others are watching you, you generally do better at it. And that's called social facilitation. So you might have heard this fake it till you make it thing. It's really what social psychologists call the foot in the door. So you do something small at first to just get started. And as soon as you start to take one step, one baby step, and then you can move on to being bigger, greater things. It's why when you have a salesperson and they're trying to sell you a car, the first thing they try to do is to get you to sit in the car. And that's because that's the first step. That's the first step. So all of these groups together, there's a lot more words for you to learn in the chapter. But they explain why it is that we act differently in groups than we might all by ourselves. And we all know that to be true. If you're honest and authentic with yourself, you probably have acted or behaved in a group that kind of surprised you sometimes, right? So social loafing is the idea that when there's a lot of people in a group doing the work, that we all think that everybody else is pulling harder. And so we don't necessarily work as hard. It happens in group projects a lot when you're in college, that somebody doesn't pull their weight, especially if it's a group grade rather than individual grade. But we've studied this, and they actually had measuring things. I'm not a fan of tug of war, but they showed that people put less effort in pulling when the group is bigger than if they're pulling on a rope all by themselves. So you have to be careful. What are the situations that you tend to slack off on, and maybe you shouldn't. Another term for groups is called de-individuation. When we lose our own individual identity, and when we're in a crowd, and we'll be less inhibited, less likely to think for ourselves, more likely to do violence. People who do things in groups that you wouldn't do individually. That's the whole idea of de-individuation. So Zimbardo had a study where they put Halloween candy out and asked them to only take one And what he found was that people who had a mask on or who couldn't be identified were more likely to take more of the candy than their one piece. So that whole idea of no one will be able to identify me. I don't know, with today's video cameras and cell phones, unless you're wearing a mask, you could probably be identified. And even then, this goes to show that you're not always anonymous, right? So group polarization is when people who all have the same idea get together and talk about something. The best example is politics, but not a fan of politics, or conservative thinking, or even conspiracy theories. When groups are all the same, right? They think the same way. What happens is group polarization. So that more people, when you only surround yourself with people who think exactly the same way as you, and nothing ever challenges you or gives you the opposite, then it's likely that you're going to have that. And the result is then can be groupthink. When you think everybody thinks the same thing you do, there have been some examples of how groupthink has been very negative. The space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, and afterwards they asked the NASA engineers, and several of them said that they thought it was a mistake to launch, but no one said anything, and no one wanted to break up the harmony of the group. And so groupthink is really something that only happens when you have people around you who are always going to agree with things that you say. It's one of the reasons why when we have a presidential cabinet, that we should try to have a lot of different people and not just their friends who are in the cabinet. But we know that the president gets to choose their cabinet, and so a lot of times groupthink can happen when government is making decisions. So it happens. So the bystander effect. When would you intervene? When would you say something? It's part of your discussion forum for this week. It's called shopping while black, but they are really being prejudiced against the person. Would you say something? Would you do something? If someone's cars broke down on the side of the road, would you stop and help? So 1964, Kitty Genovese, it's one of the most famous studies on bystander effect. So she was 28 years old and on her way home in New York, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, she was stabbed and attacked on the steps of their apartment complex. There was at least a half hour in which she screamed and asked for help. The murderer attacked her, stabbed her, left, and then came back and finished killing her. He was gone for like 30 minutes. The reports are anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, but he had definitely left the scene. I think about it a lot. Like, I wouldn't want to go out there, but no one called the police and no one yelled out the window. And even when the guy had left the scene, no one went to her assistance. Someone pulled her into the apartment. So the bystander effect is a big one. But like this graph shows you, you have to notice that something's happening. You have to interpret it as an emergency. And then the part that failed, I think, in Kitty Genovese's thing is assuming the responsibility. because there were so many people who witnessed it, everybody thought someone else must be going to call or someone else is going to help her. And the effects were not good because the killer came back and probably could have been. So this is a video here. I'm not going to show it to you right now, but the it is on there. It's one of those "what would you do" kind of things. And a woman is being attacked in the park, and they keep track of how many people walk by. Very, very few people stop to help the woman in the video. So when there's a lot of people, there's a diffusion of responsibility. But when one person breaks that and helps, then others usually come. But it just always takes one person to act first. A lot of times we rationalize and say, well, I don't want to get involved because maybe it's just a situation between a family. Maybe they're not a big deal. But, you know, if we don't help, sometimes that's the problem. So, the more people that are around, the more likely it is that you will not receive help. So just a little tidbit, a clue. If you need help, you need to single out a single person. Hey, person in the red shirt, call 911. They're more likely to give you the help you need. So we're more likely to help women. We're more likely to help in a small town. When we're in a good mood, we tend to help. When we're not in a hurry, and there's so many parameters, it's kind of crazy. So it's the idea of altruism, and some cultures are more altruistic than others. In the United States, because we're more of an individualistic culture, we don't help as much as other cultures do. Part you will see on the Zimbardo is the Stanley Milgram study. And keep in mind that no one actually receives a shock from this, but they wanted to test to see how far people would go in giving shocks. And at the point where if they went all the way, that would signify death. I wanted to see how many people would shock past that. What they found is that 2/3 of the people continued to shock even when the person started to beg, even when the person appeared to be unconscious. The majority of them continued to obey all the way to the end. This one has been replicated many times, and with the moment. This is part of the Zimbardo video, so you'll see that. So when a person is an authority figure, it's known as compliance, and that's what we see in the Milgram study. People complied when the person is standing closer by, when the victim is in another room and you can't see them, and when the person who tells you to do it seems to be an authority. So a lot of it has to do with the power of the individual, right? There are some people who resist obeying and conforming, and then there are others who go along with things. And it's just an opportunity to think about yourself and think how would you react if you had been in the Milgram study, you know. So this is we talk about this, and you do a little activity about it in the social psychology lab. It's known as the Robbers Cave experiment. But what they did is that they showed that when kids are fighting for equipment in the Robbers Cave, it was campground equipment, playground equipment, things like that. But when there's competition rather than cooperation, that's when you get that in-group, out-group that we talked about. All right, so that's the end of that. You need to get finished up and do the assignments that are due. And if you have any questions, just make sure you shoot me an email. Thanks.